Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. Today, we're taking a deep dive into fascist Italy, a period that saw Italy go through some really, really big changes socially, in terms of propaganda, and in terms of their, place on the world stage. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, how Mussolini, starting from all the chaos after World War I, actually managed to kind of reshape Italy so dramatically.
Yeah, it's a story full of ambition, contradictions, and I'd say ultimately tragedy. We're going to explore how a nation dealing with, feelings of betrayal and humiliation after World War I was kind of ripe for the rise of a figure like Benito Mussolini.
Okay, so let's break this down a little. We hear a lot about totalitarian regimes, but what made Italian fascism, especially in the beginning, kind of different?
One of the key differences is what historians call imperfect totalitarianism. Unlike the absolute dictatorships we see in like Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, Italian fascism had to work around some existing power structures. King Victor Emmanuel III actually remained head of state during Mussolini's, entire reign.
So it wasn't like he was a complete dictator.
No, not really. Mussolini was the Ducia, the leader of the fascist party and the head of the government, but not the sole all-powerful ruler.
So there's this kind of power-sharing arrangement.
Exactly. The fascist party, the PNF, didn't completely replace the state apparatus. It ran alongside it, influencing policy but not having, total control.
Hmm.
Mussolini relied on existing institutions like the prefects and the police to maintain order instead of just relying on fascist militias.
That's really interesting. So it's like a sneakier form of control.
Yeah, precisely. And it's important to note that being a member of the fascist party wasn't mandatory for all citizens, but, party membership became increasingly beneficial, especially if you wanted a job in the public sector.
So it's like, hey, you want a job, you should probably think about, joining the party. Okay, so if they weren't using outright force, how did Mussolini and the fascists go about, reshaping Italy?
Mussolini was a master of propaganda. He understood the power of symbols, spectacle, and really tapping into people's emotions.
Yeah.
The regime created this huge network of organizations and events designed to, instill fascist ideology and the sense of national unity.
Okay, so can you give us like a specific example of how that would actually played out in, everyday life?
Sure. One striking example is the Opera Nazionale dopo lavoro. It organized leisure activities for workers.
Right.
It provided, entertainment and social gatherings, but always with this very fascist slant to it.
So even in their free time, they were being subtly exposed to fascist ideas.
Exactly. But perhaps the most significant target of this whole fascistization campaign was young people.
Right, the black shirts.
Exactly. The Balella, founded in 1926, was a youth organization for boys between 8 and 18. It had its own uniforms, paramilitary training, and a heavy dose of indoctrination.
I was going to say.
Yeah, they were taught to be disciplined, patriotic, and, utterly devoted to the deuce and the fascist cause.
It's almost like chilling to think about like children being systematically molded into, mini fascists.
It was a very effective strategy. By instilling fascist ideals from such a young age, they hoped to secure the future of the ideology.
But what about the church? Italy was and still is a predominantly Catholic country. Surely the church wouldn't just stand by and let this happen.
You bring up a crucial point. The church was a force to be reckoned with, and Mussolini knew that.
Yeah.
He understood that the church had immense influence over people, especially in rural areas.
So how did he handle this?
He handled it strategically. He negotiated with the Vatican, which ultimately led to the signing of the Lateran Treaty in 1929.
The Lateran Treaty, that was a pretty big deal, right?
Absolutely. It was a landmark agreement that settled the Roman question, this long-standing conflict between the Italian state and the papacy.
Okay, so break that down for us. What did this treaty actually mean?
Okay, so the treaty had three major parts. First, it officially recognized Vatican City as an independent state, which ended decades of tension. Second, it included a financial agreement where Italy compensated the Holy See for the loss of the Papal States. And third, and this is maybe the most important, it established this concordat regulating the relationship between the church and the Italian state.
So, what did that actually mean in practice?
Okay, so in practice, it gave the church a significant degree of autonomy within Italy. Catholicism became a required subject in all the public schools, priests were exempt from military service, religious marriages were legally recognized, and Catholic Action, this lay organization, was given freedom to operate under the church's supervision.
So it sounds like Mussolini was basically handing the church a lot of power and influence in exchange for their cooperation.
It was a very shrewd political maneuver. By, appeasing the church, Mussolini neutralized a potential rival for, the hearts and minds of the Italian people. He gained the support of the church and their non-interference in his political agenda.
It was like a win-win for both sides, at least for a while.
Yeah, for a while.
Kind of cynical, though, don't you think?
Perhaps, but it was very effective. This alliance between the fascist regime and the church played a major role in consolidating Mussolini's power. It allowed him to further advance his project of fascistizing Italian society.
So we've got the youth organizations, we've got the public spectacle, the propaganda, and now this, alliance with the church. It's really becoming clear how Mussolini managed to create this atmosphere of fascist ideology.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that this process wasn't simple or straightforward, and nowhere is that more evident than when we look at the economic realities of fascist Italy.
Okay, here's where it gets interesting. Tell us more about the economic landscape under Mussolini.
So on the surface, there were some achievements. Italy saw a significant population increase during this period. There was also a shift towards industrialization. But the reality is that Italy still lagged behind other major powers economically.
So some progress, but not enough to, keep up with the rest of Europe.
Precisely. Italy was still largely agricultural, and the regime's economic policies, while ambitious, were often hampered by a lack of resources and also internal contradictions.
What kind of contradiction?
Well, there was this really interesting tension between the regime's glorification of rural life and its simultaneous push for modernization.
Okay.
You had this romanticized ideal of the Italian peasant, the backbone of the nation, tied to the land, upholding traditional family values.
Right.
But at the same time, Mussolini wanted to create this new fascist man, this figure who was, strong, disciplined, dedicated to the state, dedicated to the future of Italy.
Trying to reconcile those two visions seems pretty tricky.
It was, and that internal struggle between tradition and modernity played out in many aspects of fascist policy.
That's fascinating. So we've got this web of social and political control, coupled with an economic agenda that's struggling to, find its footing. What does this mean for the average Italian? How did this impact their daily lives?
That's a crucial question. And to answer it, we need to delve into how the regime exerted control over information and culture.
Let's do it. What were the tools and tactics they used to shape the narrative and mold public opinion?
Okay, so education was a primary target. The Gentile Reform of 1923 restructured the entire education system. It emphasized discipline, patriotism, and a return to humanistic studies.
It sounds pretty rigorous.
It was. The goal was to instill a sense of national pride and obedience in students.
Yeah.
Textbooks were rewritten, censored to reflect fascist ideology, and teachers were under constant scrutiny.
So no room for critical thinking or, dissenting viewpoints.
Not really. And the pressure to conform extended to higher education. In 1931, university professors were actually required to swear an oath of allegiance to the fascist regime.
Wow, that's pretty extreme. What happened to the ones who refused?
Out of over 1,200 professors, only 12 refused to take the oath. They lost their positions and faced, various forms of persecution.
Yeah.
It sent a very clear message. Dissent would not be tolerated.
So much for academic freedom.
Exactly. But controlling education was only one part of the equation. The regime also went to great lengths to control the media and popular culture.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How did they manage to dominate the flow of information?
Well, the Ministry of Popular Culture, commonly known as Minkelpop, was established in 1937.
Going.
It was given sweeping powers to censor and control newspapers, radio broadcasts, and the film industry.
So basically, they had a stranglehold on all forms of mass communication.
Pretty much. They determined what news was reported, what opinions were expressed, and what entertainment the public could access.
It sounds like a recipe for misinformation and, straight-up propaganda.
It often was. But there was a more subtle side to it, too. The regime understood the power of cinema, not just as propaganda, but as a way to shape national identity and promote a particular vision of Italian culture.
Okay, so it wasn't just about spreading, blatant propaganda. It was about creating a whole cultural atmosphere.
Yes. And to achieve that, they invested heavily in the film industry. In 1937, they established Cinecittà. It's a massive film studio complex in Rome.
Cinecittà. I've heard of that. That's still operational today, isn't it?
It is. It's one of the largest and most famous film studios in Europe. But back then, it was a symbol of the regime's ambition to use cinema as a powerful tool, shaping public perception, promoting their agenda.
It's amazing how art and culture can be, like, weaponized so effectively.
Absolutely. And under Mussolini, that's exactly what happened. Welcome back to our deep dive into fascist Italy. Last time we were talking about how Mussolini consolidated his power and started, reshaping Italian society using things like youth organizations, the Lateran Treaty, and that really powerful propaganda machine.
Right, right. All those attempts to, like, control information and culture. Really fascinating, but kind of heavy stuff.
It is, it is. And today we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at the economic policies of the fascist regime.
All right, let's talk money. So what was the economic philosophy of fascism? What were they trying to achieve?
Well, they sought to create what they called a third way, an alternative to both, laissez-faire capitalism and Soviet-style communism. The idea was a system where the state played a strong role in guiding the economy, but without completely, abolishing private property or individual initiative.
So not totally communist, not totally capitalist, something somewhere in between.
Exactly. Yeah, kind of a middle ground.
Okay, so how did they actually put this third way into practice?
Well, the centerpiece of this whole economic vision was something called corporatism.
Corporatism. Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm not totally sure what it actually means.
Essentially, it meant organizing labor and capital into these collaborative corporations, each representing a specific sector of the economy.
Yeah.
These corporations were supposed to work together under, the guidance of the state to achieve these national economic goals.
So instead of, like, workers and employers always, at odds, they were supposed to all be like buddy working for the common good.
In theory, yes. But in reality, corporatism in fascist Italy didn't really live up to those ideals. It became just another layer of bureaucracy. And the corporations often ended up serving the interests of big business more than the workers.
Yeah, so much for that worker-employer harmony. So what other economic policies did Mussolini pursue?
Well, he launched a series of campaigns aimed at achieving economic self-sufficiency, or autarky, as they called it at the time.
Autarky.
Yeah.
Okay. And the most famous of these was the battle for grain.
The battle for grain.
Yeah. Sounds a little dramatic. What was that all about?
Yeah, it does. It was basically a campaign to increase domestic grain production and reduce Italy's reliance on imports. Mussolini wanted to make Italy self-sufficient in food production.
Okay.
This drive was partly fueled by economic concerns, but also this desire for national pride and independence.
Right. So did it work? Did Italy actually become self-sufficient in grain?
Well, to some extent, yes. Domestic grain production did increase, but it came at a cost.
Oh.
The focus on grain production meant that other crops were kind of neglected, and some argue that it actually hurt the overall agricultural sector in the long run.
So this push for autarky, wasn't really working out as planned. What about the global economic context? Like, how did fascist Italy fare during the Great Depression?
Ironically, the autarkic policies that were already in place actually helped shield Italy from the worst effects of the Great Depression.
Really?
Yeah, the emphasis on self-sufficiency meant that Italy wasn't as reliant on, international trade as some other countries, which were hit much harder by the Depression.
So it looks like they accidentally stumbled into a solution.
Kind of, but it's important to note that Italy wasn't immune to the Depression. Unemployment still rose, and there was a lot of economic hardship.
Okay. So it sounds like there was this constant tension between the regime's, like, grand ambitions and the reality of Italy's limited resources.
Exactly. And that tension played out in a lot of their economic policies. One of the most fascinating examples of this is how the regime inadvertently created a state-controlled economy.
Now, this sounds interesting. How did that happen?
Well, as the Depression hit, a lot of Italian banks and industries started to fail. To prevent, a complete collapse, the fascist government stepped in and bailed them out.
Right.
But in doing so, they ended up taking control of these institutions.
So they were trying to save the economy, but ended up nationalizing a big chunk of it.
Yeah, precisely. It wasn't their original intention, but that's what happened. They created these powerful state-controlled entities like the Istituto Mobiliare Italiano, the IMI, and the Istituto per la Ricostruzione Industriale, the IRI, which were tasked with managing these newly acquired assets.
Okay, and what was the long-term impact of this?
Well, it led to the creation of this vast and powerful bureaucracy that would, in many ways, outlast the fascist regime itself.
Wow.
It's this fascinating paradox.
Yeah.
In an attempt to rescue the capitalist system, the fascist government ended up laying the foundation for a much more state-controlled economy.
That is quite the unintended consequence. Makes you wonder if Mussolini ever really understood the implications of his actions.
Yeah. It's a question historians still debate today. Yeah.
But what we do know is that these economic policies, despite all their contradictions and shortcomings, played a key role in shaping the trajectory of fascist Italy.
So I've got a regime consolidating its power, reshaping society, and trying to, navigate this complex economic landscape. What happens next? Where does this story go from here?
Well, Mussolini, emboldened by his domestic successes and driven by this desire to restore Italy to its former glory, sets his sights on a much more ambitious goal.
Yeah.
Expanding Italy's power and influence on the world stage.
So here come those imperial ambitions. Where does Mussolini turn his attention?
He turns his attention to Africa.
Yeah.
Specifically to the independent nation of Ethiopia.
Ethiopia. Why Ethiopia? What was the strategic significance of that?
Well, there were a few reasons. First, Ethiopia was one of the few remaining independent countries in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Second, Italy had, a history of the Ethiopia. Back in 1896, Italian forces had suffered this humiliating defeat at the Battle of Adwa.
Right.
I see. So it was about avenging this past humiliation and projecting Italian power onto the world stage.
Precisely. Mussolini wanted to, erase the memory of Adwa and demonstrate the strength of this new fascist Italy.
Yeah.
He wanted to expand Italy's colonial possessions and create what he called a new Roman Empire.
Wow. Talk about grand ambitions.
Yeah.
But wasn't Ethiopia a member of the League of Nations?
They were.
Yeah. I mean, surely invading, a sovereign nation wouldn't go over well with the international community.
You're absolutely right. The League of Nations condemned the invasion and imposed sanctions on Italy.
Yeah.
But Mussolini, defiant and fueled by nationalist fervor, pressed on.
So he basically just ignored the League of Nations.
Essentially, yeah. He saw the League as this, weak and ineffective organization dominated by the old colonial powers, Britain and France.
Mm.
He believed that Italy had the right to pursue its own imperial ambitions, regardless of what the League had to say about it.
That's quite a gamble.
Yeah.
What was the public reaction in Italy? Did people, support this war of conquest?
Initially, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the war. The regime's propaganda machine went into overdrive,
Yeah.
portraying the invasion as this, glorious mission to civilize a backward nation and restore Italy to its, rightful place as a major power.
So they were really playing on that nationalist sentiment, this idea of restoring past glory.
Exactly. And it worked. Large crowds gathered to cheer departing troops, and Mussolini's popularity soared.
Sounds like a page right out of the Roman Empire playbook.
Yeah.
But what about the actual war itself? How did that play out?
Well, the Italian army, equipped with modern weaponry and vastly outnumbering Ethiopian forces, was ultimately victorious.
Yeah.
But the war was brutal and costly. Italian forces used poison gas, and there were widespread atrocities committed against Ethiopian civilians.
That's horrifying. And
Yeah.
what was the international response to these atrocities?
The League of Nations condemned the use of poison gas, but their sanctions proved largely ineffective. Some countries like Germany and the United States actually benefited economically from the war by trading with Italy.
So the League of Nations is basically powerless to stop this aggression. What happens in the aftermath of the war?
Well, in May 1936, Italian troops captured the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. Mussolini declared victory and proclaimed himself Emperor of Ethiopia.
Emperor.
Yeah. The Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, took on the title of King of Ethiopia.
Wow. So Mussolini basically gets what he wants. He thumbs his nose at the League of Nations, conquers a sovereign nation, proclaims himself emperor. It must have been a heady time for him and his supporters.
It was. The conquest of Ethiopia was a major propaganda victory for the fascist regime.
Yeah.
It solidified Mussolini's grip on power, and it fueled his imperial ambitions even further.
But what about the long-term consequences? Did this conquest actually benefit Italy?
That's debatable. Ethiopia was a poor country. It had few resources.
Yeah.
And it proved to be a drain on the Italian economy.
Okay.
The occupation was also met with, fierce resistance from Ethiopian guerrillas, which, tied down Italian troops and resources for years.
So a short-term propaganda victory, but a long-term strategic headache.
You could say that. But the conquest of Ethiopia had another important consequence. It pushed Italy further away from its traditional allies in Western Europe and closer to Nazi Germany.
So this is where things start to get really, really complicated. I mean, we know that Italy and Germany would eventually form an alliance, and fight together in World War II. But how did that relationship actually develop?
Well, it was a gradual process driven by a complex mix of, shared interests, ideological affinity, and personal ambition.
Okay, walk us through that. How did this alliance come about?
Well, as Italy faced condemnation and sanctions over Ethiopia, Germany emerged as one of its few supporters on the world stage. Hitler admired Mussolini, saw him as a kindred spirit, a fellow revolutionary who was challenging the old order.
So there was this mutual admiration society going on between these two dictators.
To some extent, yes. They both saw themselves as, strong men who were destined to lead their nations to greatness. They also shared a common enemy in communism.
Right. Both fascism and Nazism were vehemently anti-communist.
Exactly. And as the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Italy and Germany found themselves on the same side, supporting the right-wing nationalist forces of General Francisco Franco.
So they were fighting side by side in Spain. That must have really cemented their bond.
It did. And in 1936, they formally signed a treaty of friendship, creating what became known as the Rome-Berlin Axis.
The Rome-Berlin Axis. Okay.
Right.
That sounds ominous.
It was. It marked a real turning point in European history,
Yeah.
signaling the emergence of a powerful new alliance that would soon threaten, the fragile peace of the continent.
Okay, so we've got this axis forming between these two, ambitious and ideologically aligned dictators. What happens next? How does this relationship evolve?
Well, initially, Mussolini saw the alliance as a way to enhance Italy's power and influence. He believed that he could use this relationship with Germany to extract concessions from Britain and France and further his own, imperial ambitions.
So he's playing both sides, trying to use Germany as leverage.
Exactly. But he underestimated Hitler's ambition and ruthlessness.
Yeah.
As Hitler's power grew, he became increasingly, assertive, demanding greater loyalty and subservience from his Italian ally.
I see. So the power dynamic really starts to shift with Hitler becoming the dominant partner.
Precisely. And Mussolini, despite all his bluster and bravado, found himself increasingly drawn into Hitler's orbit, pressured to support his, aggressive foreign policy and ultimately to join him in war. Welcome back to our deep dive into fascist Italy. Last time we were talking about Mussolini and how he was getting, more and more entangled with Hitler, and we know that didn't really work out well for Italy or the world.
Yeah, he kind of miscalculated, right?
Yeah.
Thought he could play both sides and use that alliance with Germany, to his advantage. But Hitler had other plans, and he wasn't someone you wanted to cross.
Exactly. And as we move into the late 1930s, the world is really on the brink of war again. And Italy, with Mussolini at the helm, is about to make a series of decisions that will really seal its fate.
Okay, so let's dive into those final years. What was happening inside Italy, as the rest of Europe marched toward war?
Well, by the late 1930s, the regime was facing a lot of challenges. The economic situation was pretty precarious. The autarkic policies, while they had kind of softened the blow of the Great Depression, they'd also slowed down growth, and they'd led to shortages of, basic goods.
So those economic contradictions, the ones we talked about earlier, they were starting to, catch up to them.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have the wars in Ethiopia and Spain, which had, drained the treasury. They'd exposed the limitations of the Italian military.
Okay, so they're dealing with, economic troubles. They're overstretched militarily. So what does Mussolini do? Does he, pull back, consolidate, maybe focus on domestic issues?
No, actually, he does the opposite. He doubles down on totalitarian control, tightens his grip over pretty much every aspect of Italian life.
Wow. So instead of, retreating, he pushes even harder toward, authoritarianism. Why would he do that?
It's a good question. Some historians believe he was starting to feel threatened by, dissent within Italy and pressure from outside. And that alliance with Hitler, which he initially thought would make Italy stronger, well, it was becoming a source of anxiety.
Right, because Hitler is becoming more and more dominant. Mussolini might have felt like he had to, prove he was still loyal.
Exactly. Mussolini might have felt that pressure to show strength, to show loyalty, and maybe he thought that tightening his control was the only way to make sure the regime survived.
So what did he actually do? Like, what specific steps did he take to consolidate his power?
Well, in 1938, he creates a new Ministry of Popular Culture, gives them even more power to control the media, the arts, and education. Censorship, went through the roof.
So basically cranking up that propaganda machine to, like, 11.
Yeah, essentially. They were trying to create an environment where there's absolutely no dissent, where, any alternative thought was silenced.
Pretty chilling stuff. What else did he do?
He consolidated the youth organizations even more, made them mandatory for, all young Italians, got rid of the Chamber of Deputies, replaced it with the Chamber of Fasces and Corporations, basically got rid of any last pretense of democratic representation.
Wow. So he's basically dismantling any last bits of democracy and creating a one-party state.
Exactly. And it went even further than that. He launched a campaign to reshape Italian culture and identity.
Yeah, this is interesting. How did he go about doing that?
Well, they tried to, purify the Italian language, got rid of foreign words and phrases. They really pushed a Roman-inspired military aesthetic, trying to bring back the glory of the Roman Empire. And they really intensified their efforts to Italianize the populations in the territories they had annexed during World War I, suppressing local languages, local cultures.
So like a forced cultural uniformity, all in the name of creating this, this new monolithic Italian identity.
Precisely. And, it's important to remember this wasn't just about aesthetics or national pride. It was about reinforcing the regime's control, getting rid of anything, any source of dissent or difference.
It's crazy how these totalitarian regimes are so obsessed with controlling every single part of people's lives, down to the language they speak.
Yeah, it's all about power and control. But probably the most disturbing part of this whole period was the implementation of the racial laws in 1938.
Right, the racial laws. Tell us about those. What did those laws actually say?
Well, those laws targeted Jewish citizens, stripped them of their citizenship, barred them from, public office, certain professions, and they outlawed intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews.
It's really scary how similar this is to what was happening in Nazi Germany at the same time.
It is. But while the Italian racial laws were, horrific and discriminatory, they weren't driven by the same kind of, ideology of racial hatred and extermination that fueled the Holocaust in Germany.
Okay, yeah, that's an important distinction to make. So what was the motivation behind these laws in Italy?
It's something historians still debate. Some argue that, Mussolini was trying to appease Hitler, solidify that alliance, make sure he had Germany's support. Others think he was influenced by a growing current of anti-Semitism within the fascist movement itself.
It's hard to imagine that kind of blatant discrimination could happen without, some level of popular support. What was the public reaction to these laws?
That's the interesting part. Unlike Germany, there wasn't widespread public support for the racial laws in Italy. A lot of Italians were really appalled by these measures, and even within the fascist party, there was opposition to the laws.
So it seems like there were, some limits to how far Mussolini could push the Italian people in this.
There were, and that shows, I think, one of the contradictions of the fascist regime, this idea that it had all this national unity and strength, while it was masking these underlying tensions and resistance.
Like a house of cards that was, starting to wobble.
Exactly. And as Europe plunges into war in 1939, those wobbles become, tremors, and the whole structure of fascist Italy starts to crumble.
Okay, so let's talk about the war. We know Italy joined on the side of Germany, but how did that happen? What was, the thinking behind that decision?
It was a really complex decision, full of risk and uncertainty. Mussolini, even though he was, becoming more and more dependent on Hitler, he was hesitant to join the war at first. He knew that Italy wasn't really prepared militarily for major conflict.
So what pushed him over the edge?
Well, there were a few factors. He might have felt pressure from Hitler, who was demanding Italian support. He might have also believed that, if Germany won quickly, Italy could get some of the spoils of war, maybe expand its own empire.
So pressure from Germany and a belief that, he could benefit from the war.
Exactly. And there's also the element of personal pride. Mussolini had created this image of himself as, a strong man, a conqueror. He might have felt like he couldn't back down even from something as daunting as a world war.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that ego and ambition can really, play a dangerous role in
Yeah.
history. So Italy joins the war. How does it go?
It doesn't go well. The Italian military, even though they had some early successes in North Africa, was really ill-equipped, poorly led.
Hmm.
They suffered heavy losses against the British and Commonwealth forces. The war quickly became a disaster for Mussolini.
So that gamble didn't pay off. What about the Italian people? How did they feel about the war?
At first, there was a wave of patriotic fervor fueled by all that propaganda the regime was putting out. But as the war dragged on, as the casualties mounted, that enthusiasm, really faded.
Yeah, I bet. It's one thing to cheer for a war when you think it's going to be a quick win, right?
Yeah.
It's another thing when your sons, your husbands are dying on the front lines.
Yeah. Exactly. And as things started going badly for Italy, discontent grew. People started questioning Mussolini's leadership, and that alliance with Germany didn't look so smart anymore.
So those cracks in the facade were becoming, impossible to ignore.
They were. And in 1943, as Allied forces land in Sicily, those cracks become a full-blown collapse. Mussolini is arrested by his own Grand Council. The fascist regime is overthrown.
Wow. What a turn of events. So the Deuce, the guy who had ruled Italy for over 2 decades, he's toppled from power.
It was a stunning fall from grace. Italy, now under a new government, switches sides, joins the Allies, declares war on Germany.
Wow, what a tangled web. And what about Mussolini? What happens to him?
He's rescued from prison by German commandos.
Oh,
They install him as the head of this puppet state in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic. But, his time was running out. In 1945, as the war is coming to an end, he's captured and executed by Italian partisans.
a pretty ignominious end for a man who caused so much, chaos and destruction.
Indeed. And with Mussolini's death, the era of fascist Italy is over.
Well, this has been a really fascinating and sobering journey, exploring the rise and fall of this regime. So many contradictions, so much complexity. What are the takeaways here? What can we learn from, this period of Italian history?
I think there are a lot of important lessons. First, it shows us the dangers of nationalism, the seductive power of these charismatic leaders who offer, easy answers to problems that are actually very complex.
All right, make Italy great again.
Exactly. And it also shows how fragile democracy really is, how important it is to protect the institutions and norms that safeguard individual rights, individual freedoms.
Once you lose those, it's really hard to get them back.
Exactly. And, finally, it really underscores the human cost of war, the lasting consequences of totalitarian regimes.
Yeah. It's a reminder that the choices we make, as individuals, as nations, they have a huge impact, not just on our own lives, but on, the course of history itself.
Absolutely. And as we, deal with the challenges of our own time, it's important to remember these lessons from the past, to, really defend those values of freedom, of justice, of human dignity.
Really well said. I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into fascist Italy. It's been an incredible journey, full of twists and turns, triumphs and tragedies.
It really has. And I hope that exploring this, this complex and often, disturbing period has given our listeners some valuable insights.
I think it has. And thank you for joining me on this deep dive. Always a pleasure, to learn from your expertise.
The pleasure is all mine. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep exploring this topic, keep asking questions, and come to your own conclusions about this fascinating period in history.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.